To begin our code portion of this training, I have a few more items that I want to add to my form. So to do that, I'm gonna organize my form a little bit, clean it up, since we're gonna have a handful of controls here. Just gonna put a label up here, no code method with live binding. Oops. Oh, sorry, that was the name. Text. No code method with live binding. And then another one down here. And I'll do a load code method. So I'm going to do a text box and two buttons. One will be to read and another to write. And let me name these accordingly. Low code text box, low code read button, change the text as well. Low code write button. Right. Okay. Then I'm gonna double click my read button. Come back here, double click my write button. What that did was that created the event handler for me for both of those buttons. But before I actually get into the contents of those event handlers, let me do one thing real quick. I'm gonna import some of the UA libraries. Before you're able to do something like imports OPC labs.easyopc.ua. So the only reason why that is able to get recognized is because I have that reference here. If that reference is not here, you just have to right click that, add reference, and then you can browse. And it's the same DLL that we had that contained the controls. So it's just that DLL right there, and you add that. So then, because what we're going to end up doing is we're going to instantiate our client object in the code. And so to do that, we need to reference these libraries, and that can't happen without that reference there. There's a second library that we're going to be using. Oops. Okay. And then I have some variables that I want to define globally. So first I'll start with instantiating my client object, dim UA client as new easy UA client. And then as you'll see in my read and write method, and really throughout, I'm going to be referencing a specific endpoint, a UA endpoint that corresponds to the top server, and a node ID that corresponds to the tag in top server. And I'm just going to scope those as variables as well. Dim endpoint descriptor as UA endpoint descriptor. Pretty straightforward. And then dim node descriptor as UA, you guessed it, UA node descriptor. So I have my libraries imported, I have those variables scope. Now I can jump into the actual content of this read event first, and it is a single line of code, truly. I can do loco.textbox because I want the text in that loco text box to be equal to the item, the value of the item that I read. So OPC, the UA client dot read value. When you hit that parenthesis, I really like this about Visual Studio and the IntelliSense, brings up the possible overloads that we have. You can see the different options here. The one I'll be using is this endpoint descriptor, node descriptor. So pretty easy for me because I named my variables exactly that. Endpoint descriptor, node descriptor. The beauty of it is that while, yeah, IntelliSense is great and it can show you those overloads, we don't only have to rely on IntelliSense. We have really great documentation that shows this. So what I have here that I've just pulled up is the OPC Data Client User Guide. It's an online user guide, and it has this concise reference part of it. And you can see all these different methods. The read value method that we're using right now. This is the overload list. In just a moment, we're going to do the write value method. This is the overload list. And even later on, we have the subscribe data change that we're going to be using. But obviously, there's going to be situations where you want to read, write, and subscribe to more than one value. So there's the multiple values. There's also the write. There's the read multiple values, the write multiple values. And then for a subscription, you'll use the subscribe monitored item, and then you'll manage all the items that you want to monitor in a monitored item list. So, whether this is a single or multiple items, you can read, write, and subscribe with different methods. These are all UA methods. They are available. Similar methods are also available for OPC DA. So, that line of code for the read event, that's it. Now let me add the write event. And again, at a bare minimum, it's just this one line of code. And we're going to do write value. Again, you see the overload here. This is the one I'll be using. It's endpoint descriptor, node descriptor, and then the value. And now you can statically define a value here. If I put 100, every time I click that write button, a value of 100 is going to be written. But I want to leave this open-ended. I want it to be dynamic. So I'm actually, instead of a static value, I'm going to put low-code textbox.text. What that means is that anything that I have typed in that low-code text box, when I click that write button, it's going to write whatever value is in that text box to my node. I'm realizing here actually I've declared these up here, but I actually didn't set them to anything, so they're not doing me any good right now. This UA endpoint right here, this is pretty typical for OPC UA, this format. You're going to see something that kind of looks like this no matter what OPC UA server you're connecting to. You'll have a little header, then the machine IP address or machine name, and then a port number that's being used. For you KEP server users, this might look a little familiar, except your port is 49320. And then my node descriptor. The namespace index is top server. And then the actual item, that S, that represents a string, because my item ID that I'm passing right here is in a string format. Sometimes the item ID is just an integer. It's represented by an integer, so it would be I equals, and then whatever represents that UA node, and there. So now that I actually have those set, these actually mean something. So this will work. This is, with just 2 lines of code in each of the events, or 1 line in each of the events. Scope some variables, and we haven't even used this one library yet, and I declared a library. I can read and I can write. Let's run this application, see what the functionality is looking like right now. Okay, so a value of 100, and I'm going to read. All right. And now let me write a new value. We see it update on both of our controls up here. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to implement some error handling. As we said at the beginning of this training, everything that we do is going to just build on each other. So again, this is the bare minimum of code that you need, but we're going to build on this. So we're going to add a try catch method around both of these lines of code so that we can catch things like this. This test, this is a string. What I'm about to do is I'm going to try to write a string to a tag that I know is an integer. It's not going to work. If I write that, my application crashes and it cites an operation failure, OPC UA operation failure. So let me stop that. And like I said, we're going to add a try catch. Okay, and then down here, obviously this is saying try to read the value, but catch an exception. And if we do catch an exception, it's going to look something like this. Oh, you know what? I forgot a key piece. Sometimes you can output these exceptions when they're caught to a message box, in which case a new window will pop up in front of your application. But I want to keep those exceptions in-house. I don't want a message box to pop up every time I get an error. I'm going to add this list box down here, and this list box is going to act like our event log, essentially. That's exactly what it's going to be for us. It's going to be an event log. So because it's going to be an event log for us, I'm going to change its name to event log. So I can go event log dot items dot add, and then I'm going to add some static text to the output. I'm going to say read failed. Whoops. Gotta put that in quotes. Read failed, colon. And the 0 in the curly braces, that is simply a placeholder for what the exception actually is. And this is UA exception. So UA exception dot get base exception. Dot message. Oops. Sorry, that is not right. That should be that. That's right. Now down here, this is going to be pretty much the same thing. So I'm just going to copy this, paste. Again, it's a UA. And of course, we want it to say write failed. Now, there's no problem in me having both of these catches named X because they're in completely different subs. So that is it for implementing the try catch. And now we are going to go ahead and run this application and try to force those errors and see how the event log handles that. Okay, first let's read that tag. Got a value of 0. But let's perform that same test where we're going to try to write a string to this tag, knowing that the tag is an integer. So let's do that right, and saying the input string was not in the correct format. So it's getting cut. The error message is getting cut off there. So I do want to make a change on my event log here. In the properties, there's a horizontal scroll bar that I can set true. By default, it's set false, and so that way we can see more of the error. I'm gonna change the horizontal extent as well. Give it some space. Anyway, let's run that again. So yeah, like we just did, we just triggered that write failure, and we can see a little more, attempting to change an object of type string to a uint 16, so an unsigned 16-bit integer. And I'm gonna shut down the top server momentarily, and you can see right when I shut it down, the subscription up here stopped. But I shut it down so I can fail a read as well. Read failed. No connection could be made because the target machine actively refused it. Obviously, the connection was refused because the OPC server is not available. But I'm going to start it back up to show you all a feature that our users are very appreciative of, and it's that this subscription picked up almost right away after the OPC server came back online. OPC data client under the hood does handle failure recovery for you. It's not something that you have to worry about in your code. So moving right along, we have written our read value method, our write value method. We have error trapping established for both of those. The next thing that we're going to do is write a subscription. Now the code for a subscription is going to be a bit longer than what we see here, because with a subscription, there is an on data change event that gets fired, and that data change notification that comes back to the client to let the client know that the value in the OPC server has changed. We need to handle that here in the code. So we are going to do that next. We're going to do it a little differently though. This UA node descriptor up here, if you're not familiar with OPC UA or familiar with your OPC UA server, this endpoint, this node descriptor, this node descriptor can be quite daunting if you're not familiar with this format and the syntax. So we're gonna do our subscription, but we're gonna do it without having to know what our node descriptor is. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to utilize the data client's dialogues, browsing dialogues. So if we look at our data client controls, you can see there are some UA controls and dialogues. There's some DA item dialogues and things here as well. The one that we're going to use, because the way that I'm going to do it, we're not going to browse for our OPC server. The UA endpoint is straightforward, so I am going to pass that as a property of this UA data dialog. as when I select that, you can see endpoint descriptor is a property of that. So I do have to declare what the endpoint is going to be, but I'm going to do that in code in just a second. I do want to add a few more things. I want to add 2 buttons, and I want to add 2 text boxes, and I'm going to give all of these names. This first button, this is going to be the button that I'm using to actually browse for the UA item. UA item browse button. And I want that when I browse for the UA item and I select that, I want the UA node descriptor to be outputted to this text box. Let me change this real quick. Make it a little bit bigger so we can see all of that. So like I was saying, when I select my node descriptor, I want it to populate this text box. So that's why I'm going to call this UA item text box. Now this button, whoops, didn't mean to do that. This button, this is going to be the one that triggers the subscription. So this is my low code subscribe button. And I want the text on it to say subscribe. And then lastly, this text box here, I want the value of the subscription to output to this text box. So it's just going to be called low code subscribe text box. Okay. So to start with the code, I'm going to double click on the browse. I'm going to double click on the subscribe. And there's actually a third event handler that I'm just going to paste in that I had from previously. And this, as I mentioned, this last event is what's going to handle the data change notification that we get from the OPC UA server. So for the UA item browse button, when we click that, we want the data dialog to pop up. So we're going to do UA data dialog 1 dot endpoint descriptor equals endpoint descriptor. If you recall, this endpoint descriptor right here, this is referring to my global variable. So that's me designating the endpoint descriptor for the items that I'm going to be browsing for. And then from here, I'm going to say if UA data dialog show dialog equals dialog result dot OK, meaning I click that OK button on the dialog. Then I want my UA item text box. I want the text of that to be equal to the node ID that I select in the UA data dialog. Now in my subscribe button event, I first need to put in a reference to the handler below. So add handler, UA client, dot data change notification, comma, address of, and then my data change notification event name. And we can see this event handler down here now has one reference. The next line of code in here is going to be the actual subscription. So UA client dot subscribe data change. And we can see there's 7 possible overloads. The one that I'm using is this first one. Endpoint descriptor. But I'm not going to pass my node descriptor variable here. Recall that we're using the UA data dialog to select what our node descriptor is. So here I'm going to put UA item textbox.text because I want the text that is currently there to be what gets used for the subscription. And this last piece is the sampling interval, or how quickly we want that subscription to update in milliseconds. So I'm just going to do 1,000 milliseconds. And now we're going to have an if-else statement here in the data change notification event handler. So we're going to say if E succeeded, then we want our low code subscribe text box, the text of it, to be equal to the value property of the attribute data that we get as part of this data change event that gets fired. Else, meaning if anything besides this event succeeding occurs, meaning there's probably an error, want to make sure that our event log catches that. And there we go. So that is it for the code. Our form looks good. Go ahead and save that. And let's start the application, and we can test it for its full functionality. So our text box up here and our meter automatically begin subscribing. I'm going to read. Then I'm going to update the value. You can see it update here and here. Now I'm going to browse. So you can see the endpoint descriptor that we declared is automatically inherited here. So it knows exactly what OPC UA server to browse for. So again, our tag 1, this text box gets populated with the node descriptor. Then I'm going to click subscribe, and there it goes. It is subscribed. So let me write a new value and see that text box update, and there it goes. I think we've put together a pretty nice little application here. We greatly appreciate your time for sticking with us and participating in our training today. Of course, there's so much more that you can do here, especially with code, as long as you're following good development practices. We will get this application to you I may have mentioned this already. We'll be doing the same application but in C#, and we'll be getting that to you as well as some other resources. And of course, our team is always available as a resource.